Hi, this is Chuck Brayman, and I'd like to welcome you to this introduction to my new book, Drumming Patterns. Drumming Patterns is unique among drum literature. Although it presents nearly every technical pattern possible on the snare drum and drum set, it's not only a collection of technical patterns and exercises. Much more significantly, Drumming Patterns illustrates, for the first time, the simple, logical, comprehensive system which underlies all of drum technique and rhythm. Drumming Patterns is divided into two parts. Part 1 details all the fundamental patterns of snare drum technique. Part 2 details all the fundamental patterns of drum set technique. This introduction will give a broad overview by exploring chosen sections from both parts. Let's begin by turning to the introduction on page 8. Notice the phrases marked 1 through 4. The system in drumming patterns begins by defining the four most basic ways you can strike a drum: a right-handed single stroke, a left-handed single stroke, a right-handed double stroke, and a left-handed double stroke. Next, these four basic strokes are arranged into every possible combination from 2 to 9 digits in length. These combinations are illustrated on page 9. Note that they are arranged from short to long, simple to complex. For example, the most basic combination is illustrated at the top of the list, next to the 2-digit heading. It's simply a right stroke plus a left stroke. Right, left, right, left, right, left, and so on. Illustrated below, by the 3-digit heading, are the next most basic combinations. The first of these is a right-handed single stroke followed by a left-handed double stroke. Right, left, left, right, left, left, right, left, left. The next combination is the opposite of that pattern, a left-handed single stroke followed by a right-handed double stroke. Left, right, right, left, right, right, left, right, right. Below that, the next most basic combination is 4 digits in length. It's a right-handed double stroke followed by a left-handed double stroke. Right, right, left, left, right, right, left, left, right, right, left, left, and so on. By using this systematic approach, every fundamental pattern follows in order of importance and practicality. Now turn to page 10. This diagram illustrates how each of the sticking patterns on page 9 suggests a corresponding rhythmic pattern. This previously undefined list of patterns represents the basic components of all styles of snare drum technique, all styles of drum set technique, and rhythm. As a result, by relating these branches of drumming to this simple list of patterns, Drumming Patterns is able to treat all these styles, techniques, and concepts as a single related whole. Now let's begin our exploration of Part 1 by turning to the sticking patterns section on page 16. This section explores each one of the page 8 sticking combinations individually by notating them in 4 different rhythmic groupings: 8th notes, 16th notes, 8th note triplets, and 16th note triplets. For example, the first pattern listed on page 9, right plus left, begins this section on the bottom of page 16. Note that it's notated in each one of these 4 different rhythmic groupings in each one of 4 columns. Note also the 2 different rows of sticking patterns marked with the numbers 1 and 2. These rows illustrate what Drumming Patterns calls inversions. To invert a pattern simply means to start it in a different place. For example, notice that in the first row the right-left sticking starts on the first stroke of the pattern, the right, whereas in the second row the same right-left sticking pattern starts on the second stroke of the pattern, the left. The second sticking pattern, right, left, left, is treated in a similar manner on the top of page 17. Notice again that it's phrased in each of the 4 different rhythmic groupings. Because this pattern is 3 strokes long, it has 3 possible inversions, or starting points, listed in the rows marked 1 through 3. As you might guess, all of the patterns that we saw listed on page 9 are illustrated, one at a time, in these various ways throughout this section. Now let's turn a little farther into the section to page 22. Find the 8-digit long sticking pattern labeled 8A. This is a sticking pattern commonly known as a paradiddle. Now look at the same sticking pattern as it's illustrated at the bottom of the page in eighth note triplets. Note that when the paradiddle is phrased this way, the entire pattern must be repeated 3 times before it will start again on a downbeat. Consequently, because of the resulting long succession of right and left strokes, the visual notation of this could become difficult to read. To eliminate this potential confusion, the first digit of each pattern is underlined. This clearly illustrates how often each pattern is repeated and where each pattern begins. For example, note that we have here a total of 3 paradiddles. The first paradiddle, designated by the first underlined stroke, starts on the downbeat of a triplet. The second paradiddle, designated by the second underlined stroke, starts on the top note of a triplet. And the third paradiddle, designated by the third underlined stroke, starts on the middle note of a triplet. On the surface, the first section of drumming patterns is similar to the first section of another book called Stick Control. Actually, however, it's radically different in several important ways. The first way is that Stick Control only notates its patterns in eighth notes, whereas Drumming Patterns notates each pattern in eighth notes, 16th notes, eighth note triplets, and 16th note triplets. As a result, since each pattern is presented in several different ways, they become much more interesting to practice. Even more important, however, is that the reader develops the ability to phrase each pattern in the various rhythmic groupings common to practical musical situations. To notice a second important difference, please turn back to page 9. Note that there are 29 different patterns that form the basis of drumming patterns. The sticking section of Stick Control, however, limits its selection of patterns to only 7 of these patterns: the 2-digit long patterns, the 4-digit long patterns, and the 8-digit long patterns. This results in the omission of 22 fundamental patterns, all those which are 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 12 digits in length. To note a third difference, please turn to page 17 and note the stickings 3A and 3B. Drumming Patterns makes a distinction between what are actually different sticking patterns, like stickings 3A and 3B, and what seem to be different sticking patterns, but which are actually inversions of the same sticking patterns, like stickings 3A1, 2, and 3. Part 1 of Drumming Patterns is dedicated simply to snare drum technique. However, there are differences between the way the patterns are presented in the sticking pattern section of Part 1 and the way they are presented in subsequent sections of Part 1. This is because after working through the sticking pattern section, the reader will have acquired the skill of being able to take a pattern, like right, left, left, and phrase it in 8th note, 16th note, 8th note triplet, and 16th note triplet groupings. Consequently, when subsequent sections present these same patterns, musical notation is omitted. However, each pattern is still to be practiced in these 4 rhythmic groupings. To illustrate this, let's turn to page 54. Note in the upper left-hand corner the by now familiar sticking pattern, right, left, left, illustrated without musical notation. Now turn back to the introduction to this section on page 52. Take a brief moment to read the bold print, noting the example below. A second difference between the sticking pattern section and subsequent sections is that in subsequent sections, underlines are used to indicate accent, flam, or rough embellishments to the sticking patterns. For example, in the flam section, an underlined stroke indicates that the stroke is to be executed as a flam. The example we looked at on page 52 also illustrates this. Exercise 1.1, right underlined left, left equals a right single stroke, a left flam, and a left single stroke, a right single stroke, a left flam, and a left single stroke, and so on. If most books were to embellish these patterns, they would probably do it in an arbitrary way. For example, they might initially add a flam to the first stroke of the pattern, then to the second stroke, then to the third, and so on. Drumming patterns, however, takes a logical approach in both its choice of patterns and its placements of embellishments within those patterns. Take as an example again the flam section. Drumming patterns first defines what different technical styles of flams are possible and what distinguishes each one. Amazingly, this is a task which has never been formally approached before. The results are described on page 53. The first example illustrates the first technical style flam, which adds a flam to the first stroke of any double stroke following a single stroke. Notice this in the first example. The first stroke of the double stroke, the left-left, is underlined, indicating that it receives a flam, and the double stroke follows a single stroke. This is the easiest technical style flam to execute. It's the same technique which underlies the rudiment known as the Swiss triplet, and enables Swiss triplets to be executed more rapidly than other styles of flams. However, once this Swiss triplet technique has been identified, there's no reason to limit it only to the Swiss triplet sticking. In drumming patterns, this same technique is applied to all the various sticking patterns in the point 1 columns on pages 54 through 63. The second example illustrates the second technical style of flam, which is created by a flam to the second stroke of a double stroke. Notice this in the second example. The second stroke of the double stroke, the left-left, is underlined, indicating that it receives a flam. This style of flam is very awkward and difficult to execute. It's the same technique which underlies the Swiss rudiment known as the tap flam. In drumming patterns, this technique of adding flams to the second stroke of each double stroke is applied to all the various sticking patterns in the point 2 column on pages 54 through 63. The third example illustrates the third style flam, which adds a flam to any stroke following a double stroke. Notice this in the third example. The first stroke following a double stroke, the R, is underlined, indicating that it receives a flam. Notice that when the pattern is repeated, the double stroke must become a triple stroke in order to execute the flam. This is the same technique which underlies the rudiment known as the flam tap. But again, once this technique is understood, there's no reason to limit it merely to the flam tap sticking. The technique can be applied to any sticking, which is accomplished in the point 3 columns on pages 54 through 63. In this column, flams are applied within the sticking patterns to all strokes following double strokes. In the interest of brevity, we won't explore every individual section in drumming patterns in this amount of detail. Please note, however, that as in the flam section, in each of the other sections nothing is approached arbitrarily. There's always a logical method determining where and how each pattern is embellished. In addition to the flam pattern section, Part 1 of drumming patterns also includes a section where the sticking patterns are embellished with accents, a section where the sticking patterns are embellished with single strokes, and a section where the sticking patterns are embellished with double strokes, the last of which are an embellishment similar to ruffs. The next unique concept in drumming patterns is the fold-out pages. For an example of how these work, fold open page 97. At the bottom of the page is a notation labeled a 12-stroke alternating roll, which should be familiar to readers of stick control. Stick control illustrates 24 unembellished sticking patterns in this particular rhythmic scheme. In drumming patterns, however, by folding open page 97 and viewing it in conjunction with pages 16 through 85, it's possible to take hundreds of the embellished and unembellished patterns in Part 1 and simply plug them into this notation. To narrow down the selection of patterns, above each rhythmic notation are indicated what length patterns will fit easily. For example, all 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12-digit long patterns may be easily plugged into the 12-stroke alternating roll. Like the preceding section, each notation on the fold-out pages is derived systematically and arranged sequentially from short to long. For example, Open foldout page 95. Note that it begins with 4-stroke alternating rolls and progresses through 5- and 6-stroke alternating rolls. Open foldout page 97. Following on this page are 7, 9, 10, and 12-stroke alternating rolls. Short roll patterns are presented the same way on foldout pages 89 through 91, progressing sequentially from 3-stroke roll patterns to 13-stroke roll patterns. And because these patterns are on foldout pages, it's possible to plug into them not only the traditional rudimental open and closed rolls, but all the different patterns of Part 1 in all their various embellished and unembellished forms. Not only single strokes and double strokes, but also rolls with mixed stickings, rolls with flams, rolls with accents, and more. This comprehensive encyclopedia of snare drum techniques constitutes the first half of drumming patterns. In the second half of drumming patterns, these patterns are applied to various styles of drumming on the full drum set. This is accomplished by presenting various methods for converting the patterns of Part 1 into rhythms, and then plugging these rhythms into the characteristic ostinato patterns of various musical styles. As an example of this, open foldout page 135. Notice the jazz ride cymbal pattern marked number 3. This is the ostinato pattern which characterizes jazz music. It's typically executed on the ride cymbal and hi-hat with the drummer's right hand and left foot. Now, while leaving open the foldout page, turn to pages 128 and 129. These pages present a simple method for converting the patterns of Part 1 into rhythms, which may then be executed on the snare drum and bass drum in conjunction with the jazz ostinato pattern. Look at the examples on these pages, which combine the first sticking pattern listed on page 16, right-left, with some of the jazz ostinato patterns listed on page 135. On the top of page 129, the right-left sticking pattern is phrased as eighth note triplets between the snare drum played with the left hand and the bass drum executed with the right foot, and then combined with the jazz ostinato pattern. In the fast tempo example below that, the right-left sticking pattern is executed as straight eighth notes, and then combined with the straight eighth jazz ostinato pattern. On page 128, the sticking patterns are phrased in a shuffle style, and then combined with the jazz ostinato pattern. Using these methods, the student may work through every possible rhythmic pattern slowly, from easy to difficult. In the jazz section, there are several different methods for doing this. On pages 122 and 123, the first method phrases the drumming patterns on the snare drum alone in conjunction with the jazz ostinato pattern. On pages 124 and 125, the second method phrases the drumming patterns on the bass drum alone with the jazz ostinato pattern. On pages 126 and 127, the third method phrases the drumming patterns on the snare drum and the bass drum simultaneously in conjunction with the jazz ostinato pattern. On pages 128 and 129, the fourth method, as we have shown, phrases the drumming patterns alternately on the snare drum and the bass drum in conjunction with the jazz ostinato pattern. Following these are two advanced methods based on techniques pioneered by Tony Williams and Elvin Jones. In addition to the jazz section, Part 2 contains sections for rock, Brazilian, non-independent, and solo drum styles. So that's the content of the book. Now let's consider the advantage of the systematic approach used in drumming patterns as against the standard approach. In the standard approach, drum technique is taught as several different unrelated fields of knowledge. Flam techniques are taught as being unrelated to sticking techniques. Snare drum techniques are treated as a whole universe unto themselves, which have nothing in common with rock drumming techniques. Jazz is yet another universe of information with separate books and separate practice material unrelated to the material used in practicing rock or in practicing the snare drum. On the other hand, drumming patterns takes all these different drum techniques and styles and shows their interrelationships. Since they all use the same patterns, the student learns exactly what their similarities are and what their differences are, what techniques they share in common, and what techniques distinguish them from each other. As a result, it turns an enormous complexity, all these different styles, all these different techniques, all these different rhythms, all these different methods and approaches to playing the drum, and integrates them into a single, simple, easy to understand system. Even given the simplification of information inherent in such a system, the wide scope of drumming patterns content may seem to present an overwhelming amount of practice material. However, remember that the entire book, from beginning to end, is nothing more than the 29 patterns listed on page 9, reiterated over and over and over again in all their possible forms. Once the sticking pattern section is practiced, the rock section becomes easier to learn because it uses the same material. In turn, the practice of these sections makes the jazz section easier to learn. So every section builds on and reinforces every other section. This is the advantage of an integrated system. Now turn to a section titled Budgeting Practice Time on page 14. To give students a manageable amount of material to start out with, this section details which patterns are the most simple, the most basic, and the most important to practice. The information in this section is restated at the end of the introductions to each individual chapter. Also addressing the same topic is an appendix called Determining a Pattern's Utility. This completes our introduction to drumming patterns. Now you have seen that the content of drumming patterns is much broader than that of most drum books. It has material suitable to all levels and all styles of players, from beginners to professionals. Hopefully, you've also noticed that because the material in drumming patterns is objectively defined, progressively arranged, and logically organized, the information it presents is both integrated and simplified. Now that you've listened to this introduction, you're ready to begin exploring drumming patterns for yourself. Please begin by reading pages 3 through 15. I hope you enjoy drumming patterns.